All right, Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for our weekly Wednesday discussion where we're going over the book, The Autobiography of Malcolm X. Um, so Imam Khalid Shahid has been going over the last couple chapters, and this week he'll be taking a break, and inshallah will be back with us for next week. So for this week, I have been given the opportunity to lead a discussion on chapter 13. Now, chapter 13, titled Minister, very appropriately, basically covers Malcolm's time as being one of the ministers for the Nation of Islam. It picks up where the last chapter left off, where he decided to accept the position, and really just kind of covers on how Malcolm helped grow the Nation of Islam's presence in a variety of different places, in Boston, in Philadelphia, New York City, and Atlanta, to name a few. And this chapter, Malcolm gives us a lot of insight to his mentality at the time, as well as how he would approach speaking to different demographics within the Black community and to convince them of the nation, of the message of Elijah Muhammad. And what I found to be kind of particularly interesting about this chapter is some of the changes of Malcolm's perspective, or Malcolm's use of words or speech compared to other chapters. So for example, we know that for the past few chapters, he was showing an increased hostility towards the white community, those of Caucasian descent. And in this chapter, I noticed that almost every single time he makes reference to a white person, he always uses the word devil. The white devil, this old devil. He uses the word devil throughout the entire chapter, and just really showing us how the mindset that Malcolm really had at this time, and how he would express this mindset to those around him. So in this chapter, he kind of discusses Nation of Islam's da'wah strategy, so to speak, how they would spread the word in order to call people to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. And he uses a variety of different strategies that he discusses in this chapter. So for example, he discusses how they would do a lot of street da'wah, for example. They would go to different communities to call people to their message, how they would go to other Black nationalist gatherings or groups and call these people to what they're calling for. So he was very strategic in how he would approach certain groups and certain communities. He even mentions in this chapter that how important it is to kind of speak on the level of your audience. And he also, in this chapter, kind of quotes different speeches that he did during these talks that he would give to call people to follow Elijah Muhammad. And his speeches here, number one, again, just kind of highlights how, quote, radicalized Malcolm's mindset was. And on top of that, it also shows examples of his charisma, his passion, and his eloquence. And so I kind of wanted to read here just a few excerpts of his different speeches that he would do to his audience, which again will give us kind of a really good insight to the mindset of many in the Black community of that time, just due to the negative, environments that they were in. So in one of the speeches, Malcolm says, not even in the Bible. This is a reference. This is a speech that he's speaking to Black Christians. So one of the strategies that they would do is they would go to Black Christian churches and call them to come sit down in one of their gatherings to hear their message about how how the black man has been brainwashed to love the white man, and how the white man is the devil, and how the white man has forced the black community into being oppressed and being basically forced into second-class citizenship. So he says here, when he kind of speaks to his audience about some of the atrocities that happened during the time of slavery. And so he says here, not even in the Bible is there such a crime, referring to the atrocities that happened during the Atlantic slave trade. God in his wrath struck down with fire the perpetrators of lesser crimes. 100 million of us black people, your grandparents, mine, murdered by this white man to get 15 million of us here to make us his slaves. On the way, he murdered 100 million. I wish it was possible for me to show you the sea bottom in those days, the black bodies, the blood, the bones broken by boots and clubs, the pregnant black women who were thrown overboard if they got too sick, thrown overboard to the sharks that had learned that following these slave ships was the way to grow fat. And so that's just kind of one expert. So we see here that the picture that Malcolm is drawing for his audience, the very graphic, powerful picture, right? And this is kind of Malcolm's style that really kind of drew his audience to highlight certain facts in order to push a particular purpose. And of course, just to clarify, obviously no one here agrees, and this is something that Imam Khalid also made sure to clarify his last talk, that obviously no one here agrees or believes that all white people are evil or the devil or anything of that nature. And so I think it's very important. We always say that every single one of these programs are online, and we don't want anyone who's online to take what we're saying out of context or anything like that. But it's important for us to mention these examples, these excerpts from Malcolm's autobiography in order to kind of give us good insight as to just where the mentality of many in the black community was at that time and why that type of mentality and belief developed. What Malcolm is sharing here are not complete untruths. These type of atrocities did indeed happen. And Malcolm was able to communicate this message in a very persuasive way to his audience. And he even mentions how in most of his talks, and almost every single one of his talks, when he would call people to follow Elijah Muhammad, he would always start off with saying, how many here believe in what I said? And he said that almost 100% of his audience would stand up and agree with what he said. But whenever he would call them to follow Elijah Muhammad, that's where a very few of them, Malcolm mentioned, would actually follow. And what he mentions here was interesting. And what I mean by that is in Malcolm's opinion, he believed that one of the biggest reasons as to why during each of his talks, only a handful of individuals actually convert to the Nation of Islam was due to the Nation of Islam's high standards. So for example, he talks about how, in the Nation of Islam, there's a lot of discipline that's needed. And this is kind of where, when I was reading the chapter, when he started speaking about the Nation of Islam, their structure, their belief system, I kind of noted some similarities with Orthodox Islam, and of course, some contradictions. So he speaks about how in the Nation of Islam, they're not allowed to watch sports, watch movies, not allowed to dance, all these other types of things. Like the type of, it was actually quite interesting because the type of forbidden acts that the Nation of Islam set for their followers is more conservative than even some of the most conservative uncles and aunties that we see today. It's kind of interesting to notice that. But there was a heavy emphasis on discipline and character, which is very similar to Orthodox Islam, the importance of having good character, of avoiding certain bad habits, and how these types of habits and methodologies that we develop for ourselves have a direct impact on the community. This is something that Nation of Islam put to practice, even if there are certain fragments that were not really part of Islam. And another thing I found to be very interesting was when Malcolm shared with the readers how he would normally open his talk. And so I kind of want to read to you guys here how Malcolm would typically open his talks, which is something that Elijah Muhammad taught him. He would say, "In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, all praise is due to Allah, the Lord of the world, the Beneficent, the Merciful, Master of the Day of Judgment in which we now live. Thee alone do we serve, and Thee alone do we beseech for Thine aid. Guide us on the right path, the path of those upon whom Thou hast bestowed favors, not of those whom Thy wrath has brought down, nor the path of those who go astray after they have heard Thy teaching. I bear witness that there is no God but Thee, and that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is Thy servant and apostle." So besides the last part where he calls Elijah Muhammad the messenger, everything else should sound very, very familiar to us. This is basically Surah Al-Fatiha, the very first chapter of the Quran, and this is how Malcolm would typically open his speeches by, in a way, basically reciting the English translation of the Fatiha, which I found to be very interesting. And so for many individuals, these types of speeches that Malcolm would do, and the Nation of itself was kind of their first exposure to the very least some form of Islam. And Malcolm even mentions in this chapter that most people that he would speak to, he said maybe like a handful of them would actually know what a Muslim is. He spoke about how if he spoke to 500 people on the street, most of them would start with a Muslim, what's that? So he kind of highlights for us just how unknown Islam was during this time. And while the Nation of Islam, of course, their aqidah, their creed or belief system is not correct to traditional true Islam, in many ways, this was America's first large exposure to the terminology of Islam and Muslims. I think even Imam Khalid made mention of this in his previous discussions. So a couple other things I want to talk about is Malcolm also discusses his reunion with his friend Shorty back in Detroit, where he discusses how when he would meet some of his old friends, like you mentioned, Shorty, for example, many of his friends and his old acquaintances would first be a little kind of apprehensive towards Malcolm because they heard that he became more religious and kind of a different person. But when he started to speak, he would speak in that same slang that they were so used to, and it really helped warm them up to him. And why I think that's really such an important point to note is, again, it's a means of Malcolm telling us the importance of speaking the language of those whom you're with, which is a really important lesson, I think, for us as Muslims to take today. The importance of when you're speaking to a group of people, you need to speak on their level. You need to speak their language, so to speak. And so when Malcolm was able to communicate with his acquaintances in this way, it helped give them comfort that he was still Malcolm. He was still Detroit Red, for example, back in Harlem. And he discusses how he kind of discusses the condition of many of his old colleagues, of his old acquaintances. So, for example, he speaks about Sammy the pimp, who we heard from previous chapters that the last time that Malcolm spoke to Sammy was the last time he even ever saw Sammy. So we found out that Sammy, unfortunately, did pass away. He ended up being found dead in his apartment. Malcolm speaks about Cadillac, I think Cadillac Dave, or what his name, I can't remember the guy's name, guys, I'm sorry about that. But another one of his colleagues who before was known to be someone of immense wealth, who now has become a drug addict. And then he speaks about, of course, his reunion with West Indy and Archie. And as we know from previous chapters, West Indy and Archie had it out for him. Those two were on the midst of killing each other. But Malcolm wanted to go and visit Archie in order to kind of basically thank him, because after seeing the conditions of many of his old acquaintances and how far gone that many of them have become, Malcolm became thankful for being forced out of that situation, out of that environment, right? And kind of seeing West Indy and Archie and being able to make up with him and kind of just seeing his condition reminded him of, again, really two things. Number one, like I mentioned previously, how he was basically saved from being in that same condition. And number two, it was kind of a further reminder for him how, in his view, many of these individuals, their futures were stolen from them by the white man, as he would put it. He even would tell West Indy and Archie that he felt West Indy and Archie had the talent to be in mathematics, science, and all these high achieving positions, but it was due to the system of the white devil, as Malcolm X puts it, that these individuals were forced into these situations. So it was kind of a big reminder for him and a big conviction for him as the path that he had himself on. So a couple of points I want to mention before we open the floor, because this was quite a long chapter and had quite a few things to cover, so I can't cover everything. But I want to go over Malcolm's marriage to Betty X, which I found to be very interesting and kind of comedic to a sense. So Malcolm kind of speaks about how he met his wife, how they were both part of the Nation of Islam, and how she was an educator for their communal temple. And Malcolm kind of speaks about his mindset towards women at the time. We know that back in the day, Malcolm had lived a very promiscuous relationship, with many different women. And now he points out how he tries to make it a point in this time to avoid women. Basically, he wants to do his best to avoid any sort of relationships with women at this time. And he even mentions that he really had no interest in marriage. And before he even proposed to Betty X, he mentions how basically they never really had many personal interactions with one another. They're always very professional. And when Malcolm decides to take that step, when he finds out that there's some of that interest inside of him, the way that he does it, I just couldn't help but laugh, because basically how it went is he just gave Betty a call. Like we mentioned before, they never really had many personal interactions before this time. He gives her a call, she answers, he literally just asks her, "Hey, you want to get married? Are you looking to get married?" And very straight, very direct, and just straight to the point. And I couldn't help but just chuckle at that. And Malcolm kind of mentions that his mindset was, when you decide to do something, you either do it or you don't. And so Malcolm even kind of describes in this chapter that he was really not at all interested in the Hollywood version of love or romance, and he was very very unattracted to that concept, and didn't really want to play into that. So he called her, asked her if she was interested in marrying him, straight to the point. She said yes, and they basically got married within just like, I think, just a couple of days. It was very quick, very to the point, which is somewhat, again, we're kind of making some comparisons here, somewhat similar to how the sunnah of marriage is supposed to be. We know that marriage in Islam is supposed to be easy, right? It shouldn't be as difficult as we make it to this day. Not to the level where Malcolm brought it at, but marriage is supposed to be something easy and simple. So throughout the chapter, when you hear Malcolm discuss the nation, you just can always find these little gems of true Islam that can be found within the nation and its influence on Malcolm. And so the last part of the chapter that I want to discuss is the incident with Brother Hinton. So Malcom X describes an incident that really caused the Nation of Islam to gain a lot of notoriety, right? He discusses an incident in which there were two police officers who ended up brutalizing two from the nation. One of them being Brother Hinton, and the other brother of the nation ended up calling Malcolm and calling a nearby restaurant that was owned by those of the nation, and they were actually able to organize, Malcolm says, around 50 nation brothers to go and confront the police officers that did this unjust attack on one of their members. And he describes how they were not violent, they were not attacking them, but they were very firm. And they made it clear to the officers that they were not going to stand down until that they knew that their brother was receiving medical treatment and was being taken care of properly. And so they caused this huge incident where they said like around 50 of them were there, marched down with the ambulance to make sure that their brother gets the treatment that they need. And it gets so much attention that even other individuals not associated with the nation start joining in. And he discusses how this was getting the police officers a little rattled and a little nervous as to how many individuals they are able to gather. And the police officers were asking Malcolm to ask those individuals to leave. Malcolm expressed to them how they were being very polite. They were not being at all violent, and they were not acting in a way that was out of line. The police officer mentions to Malcolm that there are those that are with you who are not being as polite as you guys are. And Malcolm simply responds, "Well, that's your problem. Those people are not technically with us." So they were very firm in their stance, but they also were doing it with a lot of good character and wisdom, right? And Malcolm kind of mentions that it was this incident that really kind of put the nation on people's radar, especially in the radar of law enforcement. So very, very interesting. And he even speaks about how the nation was able to help the brother who was brutalized to get a $70,000 lawsuit, which he says is, at that time, the largest police brutality judgment that the New York City has ever paid. And again, very, very interesting. And whenever I was reading that part of the chapter, I couldn't help but kind of reflect, what are some lessons that we as Muslims can get from that? Because I think one big lesson is, we can talk about all the issues with the Nation of Islam all we want, but there are certain aspects of the nation I think there are something that we can learn from. So for example, the concept of unity And I think that this particular incident that Malcolm describes in the end of the chapter just shows how unified they were. Over 50 members of the nation were able to come together in a relatively short period of time, and were able to make a stand without causing any sort of chaos or violence, and to show solidarity, right? So really, really interesting. And I think with that, we'll go ahead and close the live stream portion of the program. And from there, we'll go ahead and open the floor for discussion in the Zoom meeting. Thank you for those who are watching via the live stream. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll see you all next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.